The Volkswagen ID.4. Currently the only member of the ID family here in the US, it certainly won't be the last. Soon we'll be seeing a production version of the ID Buzz, which is just an electric reincarnation of the classic microbus, and I'm very excited to see how that turns out. Now the ID.4 here, you could only up until this point get a single motor rear-wheel drive variant, but that all changes with this, the all-wheel drive ID.4. The changes to this ID.4 are completely under the skin, so you're not going to notice any design changes or tweaks. The only way you'll be able to tell that this is all-wheel drive is by the badging on the side right here. Now, overall, the ID.4's design for me is the proper balance between cutting edge and conventional. It has a conventional shape, but it has a really unique LED design treatment up front, dynamic flowing lines, and optional two-tone color palettes that, for me, are totally palatable. In terms of overall size, the Volkswagen ID.4 looks longer than it is, but in fact, it's actually 7 inches shorter than a Tesla Model Y, its closest competitor. Now, the Model Y does squeeze in a ridiculously tiny third row in the back seat there, and thankfully the ID.4 does not, and I'm glad, because that would be some black magic if they did that. Now, Volkswagen will tell you that this is more of a RAV4 Tucson competitor, and in fact, this is closer in size to those. About an inch or so separates them in length. Cargo space in the ID.4 all-wheel drive version is absolutely identical to that of the rear-wheel drive because, obviously, the new components that add to the drivetrain are all up front. That second motor does not change anything back here. So we're still stuck with 30.3 cubic feet of space, which is decent for the class, but of course three or so cubic feet less than the Tiguan's rear area. But if you want to fold the seats down, which you unfortunately cannot do from the back here, there aren't any levers on the side, you'll have to go around front to do that. You actually get 64.2 cubic feet of space with those seats down, which is only 1 cubic feet less than the Tiguan's. Front seat comfort benefits generously from the modular electric platform that this rides on, and that doesn't change at all with the addition of the front electric motor. If you're comparing this to a Hyundai Ioniq 5 or a Kia EV6, this is going to feel more like an EV6. And the reason is, with the Hyundai, you get a completely flat floor across the entire front seat, and the console doesn't come in between the two sides. In the EV6, it's more like this situation, where there is a partially floating console here and a pass-through underneath, but the floor isn't completely flat and you cannot move this out of the way. The front seat can be adjusted in 8 different ways, and it has a 4-way power lumbar support as well. In terms of headroom, keep in mind that I'm only 5'9", but I've got about 6 inches or so left between my head and the shade of the moonroof. If you were to open the moonroof, you might even get a half an inch to an inch more. So taller drivers are going to find this to be quite comfortable up here. Down below, however, the seat bottom cushion isn't the longest and it can't be extended. So longer leg folks might find it lacking support for them. So make sure you test drive one in person, sit in the car, see if it works for you, because that is something you don't want to have to deal with once you've bought this vehicle. With the front seat here put in the position I would have it at 5'9" tall, I have quite a bit of space back here, plenty for, the average size adult. I've got 3 inches of knee room left. Foot room is on the smaller side, it's a little tight down there, but you can see what's going on down there. Say you lose something or you drop an item and it rolls under the front seat, there's illumination down there, so you're going to have a much easier time finding it in this than many other cars out there. The ID.4's interior is what I would call a 21st century minimalist design done right. It doesn't bombard you with touchscreen controls for every single function. It has a nice solid mixture of physical buttons as well. However, those buttons are capacitive touch buttons, and I know some people don't like those. In the ID.4, I think they work quite well. For example, if I wanted to open the shade for the moonroof, I just slide my finger across this strip right here, and you'll notice the shade begins to open. I also can turn on the lights up here by just tapping them like this. One other thing to note up front is that these are actual captain's chair style armrests instead of one single piece above the center console. So these can be adjusted independently of each other up and down, so each seat can have the perfect position that they want. The door panels consist of this brown, leather-like soft material where you're going to rest your arm down here, black injection molded plastic up here that is soft to the touch, and then piano black plastic over by the door control switches. The two-tone color scheme continues over on the dashboard. Here we'll find that same brown color up top that we found over on the door panel, but here it's accented with this sort of double white French stitching, which looks very good. In the center here, it's sort of a silvery metallic trim, but it's definitely still just plastic. That's where you're going to find your air vent control over there. In between the black area and the silver area is our ambient lighting, which continues right through here and goes all the way across the dashboard that way, and that looks really nice at night. Down below, this material is definitely hard plastic, but it's an area you're going to get scuffs on anyway, so the easier to clean, the better in my opinion. Unlike some of its competitors, the ID.4 sticks to a more traditional setup for its dashboard. It is still touchscreen based and touch capacitive button based, like I mentioned earlier, but here you have this nice ledge that you can rest one finger on in order to use it for support to push any of the functions on the screen you need. I find in those other models that, sometimes if you're going down the road and you need to make a selection, which you should avoid doing at all costs, but if you do need to while you're driving, those are hard to find what you need to hit. So like if you're bouncing along and your hand's shaking a little bit, you sometimes end up hitting things you don't want to. Here you at least have this to rest on and therefore gain more control of what you actually want to select, and I quite appreciate that, as well as the fact that the touch buttons here are a good ways above this ledge right here, so you're not going to find yourself accidentally hitting any of these controls. Speaking of the controls, they are sliders and you can just tap them as well. So if I want to do volume up and down, I can just tap, 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 or you can kind of slide it like so. The steering wheel here is ripped straight out of the other Volkswagen products you can currently buy, including the regular rear-wheel drive ID.4. Nothing has changed here. And I'm happy with that because I really like how they've done the sort of Mercedes-Benz style single panel for all the buttons. So on this side, this is one continuous panel, and when you push down on the function you want, you get haptic feedback and an audible tone from the infotainment system to confirm that you've hit what you want to hit. And I think it makes up for the lack of actual tuning knobs or volume knobs, because if you don't want to reach over here and do the ledge situation I mentioned, these buttons work perfectly fine, and I'd much rather handle them on the steering wheel anyway than dealing with that whole situation. And then over on the left here, we've got the cruise control buttons, which of course we have Volkswagen's IQ drive system of lane keep assist, adaptive cruise control. All of that stuff is standard and it works pretty well. In the center, we have what is probably the tiniest instrument cluster I've seen in a very long time, but they did such a good job of cramming in information in there and keeping it simple and easy to understand. So say you're driving along, you've got that speedometer in the center. Once you turn on the adaptive safety features, that card on the left will start to show you the stuff that's going on, but the view button right here allows you to shuffle and make that bigger. So I can go left and maximize that area so I can have a better view of what I'm seeing up there, or you can go back over to the center, and then if you have, say, navigation going on the right, that would pop up on the right and expand into the center. The shifter here is the same kind you're going to find in pretty much all ID models going forward. It's this twist to activate situation, and you push the button here to park. As we set off on the infamous gravel road here, I want to start by saying that I'm a big fan of this ID.4. Now, to be completely transparent, I have not driven the rear-wheel drive variant, so I can't compare the power or anything to that model, but what I will say is I think this is overall such a well-rounded electric car. For the size and the footprint of the vehicle, it's very easy to drive. The steering actually has a decent amount of feedback coming through the wheel. You can actually feel some of the stuff happening on the road. It's not the heaviest steering and it's not the most direct, but for what this is, it's completely acceptable, and a matter of fact, above par for a lot of the cars out there. The turning radius on the ID.4 is like 36 feet or so. That's actually 3 feet more than the rear-wheel drive model just because of extra components up front, but it's actually still a really small circle to work with. This is 2 to 2.2 seconds faster than that rear-wheel drive model. With 339 pound-feet of torque that's instant off the line, you notice the difference, I'm sure. This is, again, perfect for families who have maybe smaller kids or even older grandparents in the car with them that want to have an experience that's not going to actually scare anybody. The power here is that perfect sweet spot. Again, cabin noise also is going to be like other electric cars and, of course, the rear-wheel drive model in the fact that there's no engine noise to compete with, so you're going to hear more of the road outside and the wind noise. But for the most part, it's very controlled, so I don't really have anything negative to say about all that. And if you shift it up into the B mode, the regenerative braking is actually the perfect amount. You can't really change how much regenerative braking you do get, but I really like to keep that feature on. I know some people don't love it, but I think it works around town quite a bit. And you can, of course, get used to how long the stopping distance becomes when you have the regenerative braking on. And then you're also going to help put juice back in the battery, so that's always nice. This is no Tesla Model Y performance. And that's okay, because this is more for people who want to have a civilized experience but have enough power to get out of their own way. And there is plenty of power here. It's 339 pound-feet of torque that's instantly available. The braking experience here is nothing really to write home about. It's sort of a spongy mishmash down there when you do press on it. You kind of feel the components down there switching between the regenerative and the actual physical brakes. But it's not bad enough to be a complaint for me. So at the end of the day, what I'm doing right now, cruising along on a nice country road with smooth pavement and all that is where this car shines. It's quiet enough, it's smooth, it's just a really nice package.
Thanks, Brian, for showing us around the ID.4. Now let's dive into the pricing. The ID.4 starts at $40,760. That's for the rear-wheel drive model, but it does qualify for the full $7,500 federal tax credit. And because Volkswagen has not produced too many EVs in the U.S. up till now, they have the vast majority of those tax credits still available. I expect the ID.4 will have plenty of tax credits for at least 2 to 3 years going. That means it's going to be about $33,260 if you qualify for that full tax credit. If you want all-wheel drive, that's $44,440. That gets you 295 horsepower in addition to the all-wheel drive system because, of course, the way we do all-wheel drive in modern EVs is stick another motor in the vehicle. 2022 also adds a few extra features that we didn't have in 2021, according to Volkswagen. Auto brake hold, some EPA range improvements, although I don't have official details on those range improvements just yet. Volkswagen has said that they're coming soon. I expect them to be relatively minor, probably 5 to 10 miles of range here and there. The more important change is faster DC fast charging, now up to 135 kW. Volkswagen would like you to think of the ID.4, especially the all-wheel drive ID.4, as a competitor not to a Tesla Model Y, which is significantly more expensive, but rather as a competitor to something like a Volkswagen Tiguan. So let's talk about that first. A mid-level Tiguan is going to be a little bit less expensive. It's going to have a slightly larger cargo area. We find 37 cubic feet in a Tiguan versus 30.3 cubic feet in the ID.4. It is available with an optional third row. It's a pretty tiny third row in the Tiguan, but I do like that particular feature. Of course, that's available in the Tiguan because of its size. The Tiguan is about 5 inches longer than the ID.4, so certainly keep that in mind. If you were to compare cargo room and interior room to a crossover that was about the same size as the ID.4, then you'd be looking at something along the lines of a Mazda CX-5. And in that comparison, cargo room, legroom, interior room, etc. is very, very comparable to something like that Mazda. Also pretty similar to the average compact crossover is ground clearance, and that's not something that we see in all new EV crossovers. The Mach-E, the Ioniq 5, the EV6, etc., those all have relatively low ground clearance numbers in order to improve the aerodynamics of the vehicle. And Volkswagen realized that they were chasing a slightly different shopper. They're really targeting this at someone that is looking at a Tiguan, a CR-V, a RAV4, etc., but they might be interested in an EV. So they wanted to really replicate that format. Large square cargo area in the back, reasonable amount of ground clearance, all-wheel drive available. Volkswagen also gives you a small towing capacity, although I do wish it had a 2-inch receiver from the factory. Now let's talk about cost of operation, because again, this is going to be a little bit more expensive than a Tiguan, but you will likely recoup that. At $3 a gallon and 12 cents a kilowatt hour, the ID.4 should be nearly $1,200 less a year to run. And this number is obviously going to change based on the cost of electricity in your area and the cost of gasoline in your area. If you live in a state like Texas, it actually may be an even shorter payback window because electricity is very, very inexpensive there. If you live in a high-cost state like California, then that window may stretch out a little bit depending on where you get your power from. And that where you get your power from thing is important. If you have the ability, for instance, to charge at work for free, then you could be offsetting even more expense onto your employer basically and drop that cost of operation. Or if you feel like going to an Electrify America station and filling up, for the first 3 years, that is going to be completely free in the ID.4. That tie-up is likely possible because Volkswagen essentially owns Electrify America, so it's no wonder that we get free charging on that network. But if you like to do road trips, or if you just live in an apartment and you want an EV, that's going to be a huge deal for you for 3 years. If you lease your vehicle, your fueling could be completely covered for that time period. The big thing to keep in mind, of course, is that you need to qualify for the full tax credit to get it, and that means that you have to have a minimum federal tax liability of $7,500 in order to get the full tax credit. And some folks out there, if you've got 2 or 3 kids and you have a mortgage, etc., depending on your income level, you may not be paying that much in federal taxes. So that is certainly something to keep in mind. With that out of the way, let's dive into the EV competition. The Mustang Mach-E is probably the elephant in the room that we should talk about first, obviously aside from the Model Y, because it's another seemingly affordable EV from a mainstream auto manufacturer, from Ford, and Ford has been selling quite a lot of them, so many that they're really ramping up production internationally. But in many ways, the Mach-E was designed to compete more with the Model Y than the average RAV4 or CR-V. And I think that's really obvious, not just in the general styling and form of the vehicle, but also the way it's priced. It starts at $43,895, so already more expensive than the ID.4. And if you want all-wheel drive, it's going to be more expensive than that, $46,595. It's also not going to get you quite as far. The range is about 20 miles or so shorter. Now, 0 to 60 times are excellent because, again, they're trying to chase that luxury EV shopper out there. The interesting thing with EVs, and probably the most important thing when comparing one EV to another, if you're interested in performance, is don't look at the horsepower numbers. Look at the performance numbers. Because 266 horsepower in the Mach-E sounds like it should be slower than 295 horsepower in a dual-motor ID.4, but in fact, the Mach-E is going to be swifter 0 to 60. If an EV manufacturer chooses to dial in all the torque from a standstill, or say from 5 miles an hour or 10 miles an hour, versus ramping it up more slowly until you approach maybe 30, 35 miles an hour, as we see in the ID.4, then you're going to get better 0 to 60 times, even though peak horsepower or peak torque might be a little bit lower. And I think that's one of the reasons that a number of EV manufacturers out there have started to really shy away from direct horsepower numbers. Because in an EV, it's honestly a little bit less important than with a turbocharged engine or a naturally aspirated engine, which have very predictable power delivery characteristics. Now, let's get back to the Mach-E here. The Mach-E has bigger screens on the inside. It has over-the-air updates that affect more of the systems on the vehicle. More of the vehicle itself can be over-the-air updated than we find in the Volkswagen currently. It also offers the promise of Ford's Blue Cruise and a little bit of a roomier interior depending on the dimension you're looking at. There's a bit more legroom in the Mach-E, but the cargo area in the back I think is a little bit squarer, a little bit better shaped in the ID.4, but it doesn't have the front trunk. Now, as I've said before, the big reason that we don't have a front trunk in the ID.4 is just that it's smaller. If they were to make it the same length as a Mach-E or a Model Y or whatever it is that you want to insert there, they could have put a front trunk in it, which stretched out the hood. But in a logical world, it makes more sense to have that space in the back because the cross-sectional profile is wider in the rear. That's the main reason that we don't have one in the ID.4. There is, of course, empty space under the hood of the ID.4. Some of that's reserved for the crash structure, but I do wish they'd given us a tiny little pizza box area where you could put charge cables. Next up, we have the Ioniq 5. It starts at $43,650 for now. There will be a $39,700 model a little bit later, but that's going to really drop power levels down to 168 horsepower. Hyundai probably wouldn't describe that model as a loss leader, but I think it's really obvious that Hyundai really wanted to target a low sticker price with that model, and I don't expect too many people are going to opt for it. Most people, I think, are going to want to get the one with over 300 miles of range or 256 miles of range if you choose the all-wheel drive option. Now, the Ioniq 5 is going to be more expensive than the ID.4. The delta is not as large as we see in the Mach-E versus ID.4 comparison, but it is definitely still there. Now, when comparing the Mach-E to the ID.4, for that extra cash, you're getting a little bit of extra 0 to 60 performance, not too much of a handling improvement depending on the model you're looking at, and relatively similar DC fast charge rates. But versus the Ioniq 5 or Kia's EV6, we get considerably faster charge rates, and that could be important for some folks. If you do plan on using your vehicle for road trips and you want that fast charge rate, but you have to pay for the charging because there is a little bit of included DC fast charging, but not much, you can go from 10% to 80% in just 18 minutes. If you're an EV road tripper, that will literally mean that you will be stopping for less than half the time that it would take to stop and charge an ID.4 or a Ford Mustang Mach-E from 10% to 80%. And if you want to go all the way to 100%, the Ioniq 5 and the EV6 are going to be even faster, simply because of the battery pack design and the fact that they support 800-volt charging. Unfortunately for the Ioniq 5, availability is a bit of a problem because Hyundai has not said how many they're committing to build, how many they're committing to send to the United States, or even when all 50 states will actually be able to have Ioniq 5s on the dealer lots. Right now, it's only going to be sold in about 12 to 14 states in the US. The ID.4, on the other hand, is going to be sold everywhere. Actually, it already is sold everywhere, I should say, and it's going to be built in the United States this calendar year. I was able to tour that factory last year, and they were already doing pre-production runs. The ID.4 all-wheel drive is going to be built in the US, and there are also going to be some imported models from Germany, but over time, it's going to shift to primarily US production for the US market. So if you're looking for another US-built EV, this is going to be one of the few. The Mustang Mach-E is built in Mexico. The Tesla Model Y is, of course, built in the United States. Now let's talk about the Model Y. The most important thing to understand is that the Model Y is significantly more expensive. Not only does Tesla not have the $7,500 tax credit anymore, the MSRP is simply higher. Because most EV shoppers qualify for that federal tax credit, the delta for most people is going to be around $21,000. That's a pretty significant price bump. That means that you could buy an ID.4 and a Volkswagen Jetta and still be a little bit less expensive than a Tesla Model Y. That's how much more that Tesla is. Now, if you're honestly debating between these two vehicles and you can afford the Model Y and you like the Model Y, then buy the Model Y. There are definitely areas where the Model Y is better ostensibly than the ID.4. It's faster than the ID.4. It stops better. It handles better. It's more efficient. The supercharging network is definitely an asset, although it's not free, and the charging for 3 years is going to be free on the ID.4, but there are definitely areas where it is better. It's just that it's going to be a lot more expensive. The dual motor setup is standard in the Model Y. It starts at $58,990. Availability is pretty decent. You can effectively get it everywhere in the US, even though some states do make purchasing it a little bit tricky because of certain dealer franchise laws. Again, performance is definitely an asset for the Model Y, as is, I think, interior design. I do like the clean, linear design that we find in the Model Y. I do have some gripes. I wish there was an infotainment system separate from the instrument cluster. Wish there was one behind the steering wheel and one in the center like we find, for instance, in the Mustang Mach-E, but I could probably live with that particular tweak. There's also a teeny tiny third row if you're interested in that, much like we find in the Volkswagen Tiguan. It's going to be useless for some folks, but somewhat important for other people. I like that Tesla is offering that option. And then, of course, there is brand, which absolutely cannot be overstated. One of the big reasons to buy a BMW or a Mercedes is for the logo on the front, and a big reason to buy the Tesla is for the Tesla logo on the front. Some people will explain it away by saying, well, I can play games on my center console, or I could do this, or I could do that. But you know what? You could also do that in an ID.4 with a tablet, and you could buy a new tablet every year for 20 years and still be less expensive than buying a Model Y. This is the usual discussion that you can have when talking about any mainstream vehicle versus a luxury vehicle, however. It's exactly the same sort of thing. Is a Audi Q5 better than a Volkswagen Tiguan? Sure, to some people. It just depends on how much those luxury amenities mean to you, how much the extra features that you might find in that luxury vehicle, etc., mean to you. And if the answer is it's worth $20,000, then you have your answer. Go buy the luxury branded vehicle. This is a debate that really has no right answer. So I would love to know what all of you think about that down there in the comment section below. If you had $60,000 to spend on your next EV, would you get something like an ID.4 and a Volkswagen Jetta, or would you pocket the extra cash, or would you bump up and get the Model Y? There are, again, obviously reasons that you might want the Model Y. But on the other hand, I would also love to hear from the folks out there that are honestly considering the ID.4 in the way that it was intended, as an alternative to a gasoline-powered crossover. This is the new kind of EV that we're starting to see in the world that is absolutely essential for the EV transition if you believe in it. If you think that everybody out there should be driving an EV, we need more EVs like the ID.4, and honestly, not too many more like the Model Y, because the luxury segment is not the biggest segment in the United States. We need everyday EVs. EVs for the segment where the volume is. There are over 400,000 approximately RAV4s sold just in the United States. If you could get a fraction of them to move over to full EVs, you would have a huge impact versus moving a fraction of BMW X3 shoppers over to a Model Y, for instance. Let me know what you think about that down there and what you think about the ID.4. I'll see all of you later. Be sure and check out our new EV channel. You'll find that at EV Buyer's Guide. You can search that on YouTube. There's also going to be a link down there in the description. See all of you next week.